Welcome to Life Stories, where real stories of love, redemption, and unexpected twists come to life. In today's tale, we meet David West, a billionaire who has always believed that money can solve everything. But when his son falls into a mysterious coma, David is faced with a challenge money can't fix. Just when all hope seems lost, a homeless girl named Lily steps into their world and performs a miracle. Her unwavering faith changes everything, leading David on a journey that will transform his life forever. Don't miss this powerful story. Subscribe to the channel and let's begin today. David West was a man who thought he could solve anything with money. Power, wealth, influence, he had it all. He had built his empire from the ground up, clawing his way to the top through mergers, deals, and sheer force of will. The towering buildings that bore his name stood as a testament to his success, and the bustling streets of New York seemed to bow in deference to his accomplishments. But none of that mattered anymore. As he sat by the sterile hospital bed, the steady beeping of the machines was the only sound that filled the room. His 12-year-old son, Noah, lay unconscious before him, trapped in a coma. The doctors had tried everything, the best specialists, the most cutting-edge treatments, and even experimental procedures. David had spared no expense in his search for a miracle. But the miracle had yet to come. Noah's accident had been sudden and inexplicable. One morning, David had received the call. Noah had been found unconscious at the bottom of an emergency stairwell at his school. There were no witnesses, no clear explanation. It was as though the universe had suddenly ripped the ground from under David's feet. And now, for months, he had watched his son slip further away from him, his hope dwindling with each passing day. Dr. Emily Harris, the neurologist overseeing Noah's case, had just delivered the worst news David could hear. She stood before him, her face etched with concern, the soft cadence of her voice betraying the weight of her words. "David, I'm afraid the latest scans show a significant decline in brain activity. We may need to start considering palliative care." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. It was as if someone had taken his entire world and turned it upside down. The pain of those words was more crushing than any loss he had ever experienced. And it felt as if the walls were closing in on him. "Are you telling me to give up?" David's voice cracked with raw emotion, his grip on Noah's limp hand tightening in defiance. "I'm telling you to prepare," Dr. Harris said gently, her tone heavy with sympathy. But her words were final. David couldn't accept it. He couldn't accept that his son, his precious Noah, might be lost forever. How could he? He had conquered everything in his life, from business rivals to financial crises. With the sheer force of his will, he had built an empire. But now, sitting in this cold, sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines that hummed softly in the background, he felt completely powerless. No amount of money could fix this. No amount of influence could change his son's fate. In the nights that followed, David would stay by Noah's side, whispering words of apology, regret, and love. He would hold Noah's hand tightly, willing him to wake up. "I'm sorry, son," he would whisper, his voice thick with guilt. "I should have been there for you more. If only I had spent less time chasing deals, less time in meetings. I should have been a better father." But it was all futile. The silence in the room was deafening, and his son remained motionless, as though the universe had closed its doors to him. One evening, as David sat in the dimly lit hospital room, a knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. He assumed it was another nurse coming to check on Noah, or perhaps an orderly bringing a report. But when he turned to look, it wasn't a nurse who stood in the doorway. It was a young girl, no older than 15 or 16. Her clothes were tattered, her hair tangled, and she was barefoot despite the chill in the air. Her face was smeared with dirt, and her eyes that burned with a fierce determination, looked straight into his soul. For a moment, David was speechless, unsure of what to make of her. She didn't belong here, not in a hospital, not in this world of sterile walls and polished floors. "I know how to save your son," the girl said, her voice steady despite her appearance. It was a statement, not a question. And there was something in her voice, something certain and unshakable, that caused David to pause. Before he could respond, the nurses rushed into the room, their voices raised in confusion as they tried to remove the girl. But David, despite his disbelief, held up his hand to stop them. He was unsure of why he was doing it, but something about the girl's presence made him hesitate. She wasn't just a street kid, there was something deeper within her. "My name is Lily," she said, her voice calm, even though her appearance suggested she had lived through far more than any child should. "Please, you have to let me help him." David was torn. Was this a cruel joke? A scam? The desperation in his heart screamed for anything, any shred of hope, and yet his mind screamed at him to be cautious, to be rational. He had built his empire on logic, on numbers, and yet here he was, staring at a homeless girl who claimed she could save his son. "Help him," David whispered, barely able to believe the words coming out of his mouth. "How?" Lily took a step forward, and without asking for permission, she reached for Noah's hand. The nurses watched in silence, unsure whether to intervene, their eyes filled with uncertainty. David didn't stop her, even though every instinct told him to push her away. There was something about the girl, something in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, that made him want to believe her. She closed her eyes for a moment, and then she spoke. "Faith," she said softly, her voice unwavering, almost as if she were speaking to something beyond this world. Then, to David's astonishment, she began to pray. At first, her words were faint, so soft he could hardly hear them. But as she spoke, her voice grew stronger, filled with an intensity that sent a chill through his body. "Lord," she whispered, "I come before you with faith, asking for your mercy. This boy is not ready to go. Please bring him back. Let your light shine through him. Let him wake up. Let his father see that miracles are real." As she prayed, David felt something shift in the air around them. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The machines that had once emitted a constant, lifeless beep suddenly seemed to take on a different rhythm. David's heart raced in his chest. Was it possible? Could it be? Then, to his astonishment, he saw it. Noah's fingers twitched, and the soft beep of the machines changed. It was small, imperceptible at first, but it was there. The room held its breath. And for the first time in months, David allowed himself to hope. Tears filled his eyes as he looked at Lily. "What did you do?" he whispered, barely able to speak. Lily met his gaze, her expression calm, almost knowing. "I prayed," she said simply, "and God listened." David could hardly believe what had just happened. For months, he had watched Noah's condition deteriorate, helpless to change anything. But now, against all odds, the boy's fingers twitched. The monitors, which had been so steady and unyielding, now pulsed with a new rhythm. For the first time, there was hope, small, fragile, but undeniably present. The nurses in the room were equally stunned. One of them rushed to check the monitors, her face pale with disbelief. "Oh my God," she gasped, her voice trembling. "He's responding." Another nurse quickly grabbed the phone to call for the doctors. David stumbled forward, his heart racing. He grasped Noah's other hand, almost afraid to believe it was real. "Noah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Noah, can you hear me?" For a moment, there was nothing, just the steady beep of the machines. But then, something extraordinary happened. A single tear slid from the corner of Noah's closed eye. A tear that made David's breath catch in his chest. His son, his precious boy, was alive. He was awake, at least in some small way. David turned to Lily, who was still standing by the bed, her small hand resting on Noah's. Her expression was calm, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. She had done what no doctor, no treatment, no amount of money could do. She had brought his son back to life. "What did you do?" David asked again, his voice shaking. He couldn't understand it. He didn't want to understand it. All he knew was that his son was alive. And it was because of this girl. This homeless child who had wandered into his life with nothing but faith and hope. Lily met his gaze without hesitation. "I prayed," she said simply, "and God listened." The sincerity in her words was so profound. It left David speechless. There was no grand gesture, no elaborate explanation. She had just believed, and that belief had moved something greater than him. It was both humbling and awe-inspiring. Before David could respond, the door to the room swung open, and a team of doctors rushed in, their faces filled with urgency. They moved quickly around Noah, checking his vitals and adjusting the machines. But David barely noticed. His attention was entirely on Lily. She had saved his son. And now, in return, she was asking for something else. Lily looked at David, her expression serious. "Now you need to help me," she said quietly. David blinked, momentarily confused. Help her? She had just performed a miracle. She had just brought his son back from the brink of death. And now, she was asking for help? But before he could say anything, she continued, "My little brother, Luke," Lily said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "He's sick. He's very sick, and if we don't get him help, he's going to die." David's heart sank. The urgency in her voice, the same determination that had filled her when she prayed for Noah, was now directed at her brother. David couldn't ignore the gravity of her words. This was a child, her brother, and he was in need of help. Just as his own son had been moments ago. David swallowed hard. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Lily hesitated for a moment before answering. "He's on the streets," she said softly, "in an old church. It's abandoned now. We sleep there, under the front arch. But it's not enough to keep him warm. And he's getting worse." David's mind raced. He had been a part of a world that seemed so far removed from the hardships of children like Lily and Luke. He had spent his life in luxurious offices, surrounded by the finest things money could buy. And now, here was this girl, standing before him, asking for help for her little brother. A child who was sleeping on the cold concrete while his own son lay in a hospital bed. A son who had just been brought back from the brink of death. Lily's words hit David harder than he could have imagined. She hadn't asked for money. She hadn't asked for anything other than help for her brother. And yet, she had already done something so profound, so powerful, that it had defied every logic, every expectation. It made him question everything he thought he knew about the world. About power, about wealth. David exhaled slowly, a knot forming in his chest. "Where is he?" he asked again, this time with more urgency. Lily's face lit up with a glimmer of hope, and she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. "I'll take you to him." David's heart was pounding as he followed Lily through the dimly lit streets of New York. The weight of the decision he had just made felt heavy on his shoulders. But as he watched the determined way Lily moved, his doubts started to fade. There was a strength in her that he hadn't expected. A resilience that seemed to carry her through the hardships of life. She had just performed a miracle, saving his son when all hope seemed lost. And now, she was leading him to help her brother. They walked in silence for a while. The only sounds the soft shuffle of their footsteps and the distant hum of the city. David, who had spent his life in a world of wealth and influence, couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between his usual surroundings and the world Lily seemed to inhabit. He had always been surrounded by luxury, driven by power, but now, as he walked alongside this girl, this child who had known nothing but struggle, he couldn't help but feel ashamed of how disconnected he had been from the real world. After a few blocks, they turned down a narrow alley, and David felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a part of the city he ever visited. It was the kind of place where people like him didn't come. Where the underprivileged fought to survive on the streets. And yet, here he was, walking in the footsteps of a girl who had grown up in these very streets. Eventually, they reached their destination, a crumbling church that looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The building was in disrepair, the windows shattered, and graffiti covered the once grand stone walls. The front arch, where Lily had said they slept, was now just a shadow of its former self, offering little protection from the cold night air. David felt a pang in his chest as he looked at the scene before him. This was where Lily and her brother had been living. In a world where he had always had more than enough. This was what life had handed them. His gaze shifted to Lily, whose face had softened with a quiet hope. "They're inside," she said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and determination. David followed her into the church, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. There, lying on a thin blanket on the cold, hard floor, was a small, frail boy. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, and his small body shivered despite the layers of tattered clothing wrapped around him. David felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the boy. This was Lily's little brother, Luke. He was only 8 years old, and yet he looked so much smaller than his age. The boy's face was pinched with fever, and David could see the signs of malnutrition. He was too thin, too weak. The fact that he had been left to suffer in a place like this, with no access to proper care, struck David like a punch to the gut. Lily knelt beside her brother, brushing the matted blonde hair from his forehead. "Luke," she whispered softly, "I found someone to help you." Luke's feverish eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile tugged at his cracked lips. "You came back," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. Lily smiled, her eyes full of tenderness. "I always come back," she replied, her voice gentle. "You're going to be okay." David knelt beside them, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch Luke's forehead. The boy was burning with fever, his body so frail that David could feel the weight of it in his touch. His heart ached as he realized that this boy, who should have been in a warm bed with loving parents, had been left to suffer in the cold. "We need to get him to a hospital," David said urgently. His instincts kicked in, and he knew that every second counted. Now, Lily's eyes widened with hope. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and relief. David nodded. "Yes," he said firmly. "We're getting him help." He moved quickly, lifting Luke into his arms. The boy was so light that it only deepened David's sense of guilt. How had he let this happen? How had he, a man who could afford anything, never once thought about the children who were suffering right under his nose? As David carried Luke through the streets, he felt the weight of his decisions pressing on him. He had spent his life in pursuit of wealth, power, and success. But in that moment, he realized that none of it had prepared him for this. He had been blind to the struggles of the world around him. And now, for the first time, he was truly seeing the cost of his actions. They reached the hospital, and David was determined that no one would turn them away this time. He wasn't just a wealthy man anymore. He was a father who had watched his son nearly slip away from him. And he would do whatever it took to save this boy. As he entered the hospital with Luke in his arms, he was no longer just the billionaire David West. He was a man who had learned a profound lesson in empathy, in humility, and in the true value of life. And it wasn't just about saving Luke. It was about realizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in life is to reach out and help those in need. And that was a lesson David West would carry with him for the rest of his life. As days passed, Luke slowly began to recover in the hospital, surrounded by care and warmth he had never known. David sat by his side, feeling a bond growing not just with the boy, but with the whole experience. The guilt he once carried, the weight of his past decisions, began to lift. He had done something important, something real. He had helped save a life. And in the process, his own life had been transformed. The road ahead wasn't easy. But David had found a purpose beyond wealth and success. He adopted both Lily and Luke, giving them the family and love they so desperately needed. He established a foundation to support homeless children, providing shelter, education, and healthcare. He dedicated his wealth to making sure that no child would ever have to suffer like Lily and Luke had. One evening, as David stood beside Lily, watching the lights of the city sparkle below, she looked up at him and smiled. "You really did it," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You're helping kids like us." David looked down at her, his heart full. "No, Lily, you did it. You saved my son. You changed my life. As they stood together, David finally understood what true wealth meant. It wasn't about money, power, or success. It was about the lives we touch and the love we give. And in that moment, David West knew he had found something far more valuable than anything he had ever earned. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in second chances, kindness, and the power of doing what's right, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to follow more touching stories. Because sometimes, the smallest act of faith can change everything.